Hi, everybody. I'm gonna let this level off a little bit. Feel free to put in the chat where you're coming from.
I love that we're already starting with some enthusiastic claps
I
before we begin.
know, it's the
It makes me
best.
happy.
So great. All right, I think I'm going to start. Hello, thank you everybody for joining us for this session. My name is Liz Galuzas. I'll be moderating this session. I'm part of the CALM Program Planning Committee. And I'm so glad to welcome Melissa Mallon today, who's going to be presenting Beyond Quick Fixes Using Conflict Transformation for Sustainable Library Management. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few logistical items. This session is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do this anonymously. There will be 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat for general comments or technical issues. Beth is here as our tech moderator who will be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments. Beth is also going to add some links into the chat. One is for collaborative resource sharing. If you think of a related reading, podcast, video, or something else, please share it with us in Calm's Resources Zotero or in the chat. One of our volunteers will drop this information in the chat. And the next link is going to be our conference code of conduct. And a reminder, you can let any of us with Calm by us by our name about that or report something through that link. And now I'm just going to turn this over to Melissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Beth, for getting everything set up so nicely for us. I'm so excited to be here with y'all today. I've got a lot of enthusiasm for this topic, and so I'm going to try to, not let that exude out too much. Um, and yeah, I'm super happy to see everybody here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. All right. So maybe also as we're getting started, if you want to do a quick reaction, perhaps like your vibe today, how are you feeling about things? How are you coming into first session of Calm today? Yesterday was amazing. There were some really good sessions. So just hoping everybody has an amazing day today. Okay. So yes, I'm going to talk about conflict transformation for sustainable library management. What is that? Why is it important? Why am I so enthusiastic about it? Um, I really want to hear your comments and your resources and your ideas as well. So please definitely put those in the chat and look forward to talking with you through the Q&A as well. So quick agenda about what we're going to be covering today. So we'll start talking about the importance of recognizing your own conflict style, and then go through a little bit more about conflict resolution versus conflict transformation, which is the focus of our talk today. Some frameworks for implementing conflict transformation, and then finish up with some more practical strategies and advice that hopefully will help you implement this into your work. So before we get started, I did want to take a quick second to just share some acknowledgments, my sources of inspiration for this. One of which is actually my brother. He is a professor and a PhD graduate in the area of conflict resolution and peace building at Kansas State University. He's the one that really got me excited about this work and helped me start thinking about how it could apply to libraries and library management. And then also Dr. Sarah McDonald at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'll be sharing some of the resources that I have learned from her in the past couple of years. So I just wanted to kind of ground our conversation today that this is not new information. The idea of conflict transformation has been around for several decades, used a lot in the world of peace building and particularly societal peace building. And I got really interested in this and I've started learning more and doing more research. And so I'm happy to be able to share that but standing on the important work that has already been done before me. So before we get really jumping in, I would like to set a little bit of some groundwork foundation. So have a Mizzy code here, so you can scan the code, scan the QR code or put the number code at minty.com. And we're going to start here by just getting a sense of a conflict that you maybe have encountered lately in your work. So you can think big picture, you can think something really small, something that you've encountered either in your own management or just in your institution. And where are you in that journey? Are you like really, early on, or are you pretty far down the road? And I would like you to kind of have that conflict in mind as we move forward. So I'll give you a quick sec to do that. Okay, so it looks like some of you are up on the mountaintop, which is incredible, and I want to hear more about how you got up there already. That's amazing. Looks like a lot of people are kind of mid-road, some out in the trees. So that could be its own thing too. So we could talk more about that. But again, I want you to kind of have a sense of this conflict as you're thinking about it. As we go through the presentation. So we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. But the other thing that is important to think about when you are approaching a conflict, whether it's a short-term resolution or more of a transformative situation, is thinking about your own conflict style. And I'll talk more about this later. We're going to talk about some kind of introspective mindfulness work that you can do as a leader. But it's really important to think about what your own style is. And so these are categories that are based on a 30 question instrument called the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, linked to it at the end of the presentation. But essentially, there are these 5 categories, and I hope that you all appreciate that I chose characters from Beverly Hills 90210, which was pivotal in my I don't know, like formative years, learning about how mostly not to be and how to handle conflicts like a responsible adult. So I tried my best to connect my favorite characters to the different types of conflict styles. So we've got competing, which is more goal oriented. It's something on the positive side, it can be really quick and efficient in approaching conflicts, but on the more challenging side, it could breed hostility. This one is kind of known, and I got this phrasing from Dr. Sarah McDonald, but competing is known sort of as the my way type of approaching a conflict. Then we've got avoiding, which is when you're not necessarily escalating a conflict. It's more of a form of self-protection, survival. On the other side of that, though, problems can often remain unaddressed, and there could be negative feelings that could linger beyond the initial conflict. And so you can think of avoiding as sort of the no way approach. Then we've got accommodating. This is probably, I think, where a lot of us in libraries likely sit. So it's maintaining relationships, it's approaching conflict in a way that is minimizing injury and power positions and providing quicker solutions so you don't get stuck in that one place. But on the other side, it means often sacrificing your own interests and providing the opportunity potentially to lead to damaged self-esteem or even damage to relationships. So this one would be considered the your way. So it's kind of putting it off of yourself. And then we've got compromising. So this is a particularly useful approach when you have complex issues that defy simple solutions. So it's an effective way to use and manage limited time and resources, which we have a lot of in libraries. But it also means that less optimal solutions may be implemented, which means it can be difficult to practice a fair solution when power disparities exist. So this one is considered sort of the halfway approach. And then finally, we have collaborating, or as Sarah McDonald kind of added to, problem solving, which is when you are approaching the conflict in a way that really maintains positive relationships. It's a great way to build trust, lead to new possibilities. However, it requires a significant time investment of time and energy. And this one is considered the our way approach. So those are our options here. And I would like to do a quick check here to see where you all feel your conflict styles may lie. And again, this is based on a 30 question instrument. So you may not really know, but I think probably you all have a pretty good idea. So this is kind of a rating here. I think I have a sense of what we might see, but I'm curious. Oh yeah, and I see in the I'm so happy to see that people also love Beverly Hills 90210. Yeah, Liz, totally. Cindy needed to be in there. Okay, Lisa, great question. There can be an all of the above. Typically, and I do have a link to the instrument in my resources. Typically, you're going to fall more often in one or two of the categories as your most typical go-to. But the important thing to remember with these different conflict styles is that it's going to ebb and flow and be dependent on the situation. And there absolutely may be scenarios in which all five of the categories have to be applied. But again, that's going to be really contextual depending on what your conflict is. Okay, so as I suspected, the kind of the more people approached people focused approaches are more towards the top. I think that that really goes with a lot of, especially folks that are at this conference, right? Like we care about trying to collaborate and solve problems and find that kind of our way scenario. So not a surprise, but I do think it's really important for you to be thinking about your style as you're approaching, especially systemic changes to the way conflicts are handled in your institution. So let me go back to our slides. And now let's think about, what that approach looks like from more less from a kind of introspective way that you handle the conflict to what it looks like when you're trying to deal with a conflict. So just a second, I lost my chat here, so I'm gonna try to find that again. I don't know where it is. It's okay. We'll ignore it for now. Okay, so conflict management is the more typical way that people approach conflicts, and you've probably, encountered this in your work and in your life as a human being. So this is often when you're seeing critical or high emotions. It's when you're approaching that conflict, you're really trying to, in the moment, bring down the intensity. So this could be something like physical separation, if it is hopefully not in the workplace, but some sort of physical interaction. It could also be shouting, raised voices, trying to diffuse that situation immediately. Next, you have conflict resolution, which I think is something that most of us are familiar with, and probably the more traditional way that we're taught to think about how to handle conflicts. And this is coming to an agreement. It's seeking a conclusion to a conflict. The way to kind of think about that is you're shaking hands and moving on. It can often there could be a resolution, but sometimes that resolution is agree to disagree and move on. But then we've got conflict transformation. And this is really when you're using the conflict to transform relationships between parties. So it's a catalyst for growth. It's more long term, and it is something that takes time and effort to put into. So thinking about those three categories, conflict management, resolution, and transformation, I've got one more poll here for you before we jump in to the rest of our content. And that is thinking about conflicts in your workplace, which describes, which describes, that's a new word that I just made up. Sorry about that typo. Which best describes the approach. I feel like that's like a Freudian slip about how we deal with conflicts. Um, So it looks like over almost overwhelmingly so far, conflict management is definitely the highest category here. And that is very typical, especially, in organizations where you're moving quickly, you're trying to get through whatever it is that you're dealing with, and you don't necessarily have time to spend time on some of the rest of this. I'm seeing right now conflict transformation is at zero, which oh nope, there's one. Okay, is that one? Which is completely understandable. And one thing I'll say before we jump back into the content is that it again takes time to transform culture in organizations. But if you can make baby steps, that will go a long way towards really transforming the way conflict is handled in your workplace. And as we move on, I'm going to share a link in the chat here to a worksheet that you can use. If you thought of a conflict earlier when you were in that thinking about where you are down the road, you can use that conflict on this worksheet. You can kind of jot some notes down as we go along today, or you can fill it out later, save it for later. But I wanted to share that now so you can start kind of thinking through based on the approaches that you have selected. Okay, so moving on here, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So, as I noted earlier, conflict resolution is more short term. It's often more content centered, and it's really thinking in kind of in the immediacy of what we can deal with right now. So it's often when things bubble up, and it's not necessarily forward thinking. On the other hand, conflict transformation is reframing conflict, and we're going to talk more about reframing here in a few minutes. But it's reframing conflict as an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to create positive change in your organization. It's examining the multifaceted aspects of conflict to address the root causes and positively engage all parties involved. So it's not a one person, like I'm not going to be able to transform conflict on my own. I need the participation of all the parties involved in order for things to positively move forward. And I just wanted to share this quote by John Paul Lederach, who is kind of the founding scholar practitioner of conflict transformation. And I really like this idea of healthy relationships and communities. And again, John Paul Lederach and others who research in this area are often coming at it from the lens of peace building and trying to create more harmony in societies. But I think that applies really well to our organizations. Um, I don't often think of library management as peace building work, but after the day I had yesterday, I feel like it is. And I think everyone can imagine a day like that, where that's kind of all you do is you talk to people and you think about, you hear what they need and you try to help come to some way of addressing that. And so rather than just dealing with that in the moment, really thinking and being visionary in the transformation so that we can build a stronger, more healthy organization. So, what does that look like? I'm going to talk about three different sort of frameworks for how you can approach moving from the positional to the relational when it comes to conflict situations. And this is really important work because it means that you're thinking about a person-centered approach to dealing with conflicts. So it's taking you from that kind of surface level, what the wants are, where there's not really a lot of wiggle room, to more interest-based and relational focus, which is on what the needs are, and it's a more flexible approach. So it's really moving from that kind of surface level want to that deeper need to really be able to make sustainable changes. And the goal of all of this is to move towards mutual agreement and common interests. That's why it takes so long, because there is a lot that you have to unearth. So one way that you can do that is there's something called dispute system design. And this was developed in conjunction with a union environment, I believe, coal miners. And there's a lot more. I'm not going to get very deep into this. There's a lot more you can learn. And again, I've got some resources available for you to sort of take a look at. But essentially, dispute system design is a process where a neutral professional, that could be a conflict management person, it could be a mediator, it could be an ombuds person in your institution if you have those. It's where that neutral professional helps two or more parties create better methods for handling future disputes. One thing that I want to point out here is that this work often falls to library managers, which is one of the reasons that I am talking about it today. Um, that being said, that's not always a fair thing to have happen. I can't address, I can't fix that right now. But I do want to address that is a significant issue that we often are find ourselves in situations where we are trying to navigate disputes when we don't really have the training or background. So I'm hoping that we can talk through some ways of how to make that a little bit easier. So I like this system because it fits really well with conflict transformation as a theory, because it doesn't really attempt to resolve any one individual case, but instead works across kind of a bigger picture, looking at especially conflicts that may not have even occurred yet. So again, trying to identify those patterns to help us see where we're going. And these are some of the elements to kind of keep in mind if you're wanting to use this framework. And one of the things I just really want to point out here, both the relationship piece that will come up over and over, it's so important, but then also the alternatives. So thinking about what happens when agreements can't be reached. And I'll talk about this again, but not all conflicts can be solved. And so it's really important to think about what those alternatives look like and ways that you can help kind of guide the system, if even if not everyone is going to necessarily get their perspectives as high up as they might want them to be. So there are a couple questions here that can help you kind of think about um, dispute system design and how that might apply to your conflict that you may have in your mind, or any conflicts that you could think of that may occur in the future. So obviously, what is the conflict about is really important. And that is, again, trying to look below the surface. So you've got your high level, this is what it appears to be about. And then that kind of deeper level, this is what the actual issue is. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. It's also important to recognize how your organization, and this is both your library and also your institution, handle disputes, and why are they handled that way? Is there any flexibility? Is there any other way to change? Many institutions, of course, have very specific processes in place when it comes to things like performance plans and maybe HR mediated conversations when there's a really significant conflict. But are there more informal ways of dealing with this sort of thing? So kind of thinking about that. How much of the conflict cost is really in relation to your time investment and the investment of the other parties in the conflict? So thinking through what affordances can you make in terms of how much time this will take to address. Obstacles, of course, really important to think about. And the thing with some of these reflective questions and with dispute system design is thinking about that system. And that's partly where we build sustainable changes, right? Is not just at the individual level, but the system level. Again, really hard. And oftentimes we can't control what that looks like. So when you're thinking about these changes, think about what you can control and what the things are that you have that are within your ability to maybe shift or handle in a different way. And then as well, thinking about what support looks like. So another framework to consider is reframing. So I heard actually a lot about framing and reframing yesterday in the sessions that I went to, and definitely I think Merida's keynote helped us think about reframing our sort of, the busy work model to more of a, slow work model. So reframing is really important in a lot of different capacities. But in the topic area of conflict, this is when you're thinking about the fact that each party is coming to a conflict from their own frame or their own perspective is how they describe the conflict, and that rarely is the same, right? Everyone's going to have their own. And so reframing is the process of changing the way a thought is presented so that it maintains fundamental meaning, but is more likely to support resolution efforts. So, as you're thinking about how to do this, there's a couple different techniques that you can rely on. And I think you'll see some similarities here to the dispute system design that we just talked about related to needs and interests. One thing is to focus on and identify mutual interests. So this is shifting from the specific kind of immediate needs that one employee is coming to you with, like I would say maybe something like remote work days. So that person gets more remote work days than I do. This is a conflict. It's shifting from that to more general interests like overall employee well-being or benefits, or how we approach our work as an organization. So remote work is the kind of surface level, but then what's below that? It's how people are respected as employees and the kinds of things that they need to feel appreciated or fulfilled or whatever. Also looking at translating your values or the individual party's values into interests. This is identifying those overarching superordinate goals that all parties can accept and cooperatively work towards. So again, using that example of remote work, how can we develop a system that is fair to everyone, in terms of that goal? And then finally, using new metaphors or language can be really helpful in getting staff to think through or reframe the conflict in a way that makes sense to them. So this is thinking about like maybe, staff in different levels or types of positions in your library using language or examples that can be understood by both parties. So just some considerations there in terms of reframing. And then finally, something called community agreements. And this is something that I'm super excited about, and I've started implementing both in my with my teams in my library, but also in my teaching as well. And community agreements basically help a group of coworkers or students or whoever your audience is work through moments of tension or conflict. So you can use them for meetings. You can use them for your one-on-ones. They work the best when they're created at kind of the team level. So people that will be working together pretty regularly. You could also use them for committees, any number of different things where you've got a lot of different perspectives and voices in the room. So these agreements come from a consensus-driven process to identify what everyone in the group needs from each other, and that everyone is committing to each other to feel safe, supported, open, trusting. The process of creating these agreements is just as important as the product that's created at the end of it. And I have done this both as like leading this process, but also being part of a group that is collectively working to create a community agreement in a learning environment. And it's really interesting to see the things that come to light. And by having everyone participate and include, the things that they maybe struggle with when it comes to group work or group meetings, or the things that they're worried about occurring, super helpful to kind of unearth that and then let everyone agree, okay, if this arises, this is how we will move on together. The important thing about these agreements to remember is that they're not rules or norms, but rather they're more of a collective vision, if you will, for how we would be in this group in relationship with one another. So the other kind of cool thing about, like an unintended cool thing about community agreements is that in a lot of cases, the work of co-creating those agreements together may actually prevent more conflicts later on, because you've already kind of done some of that work. Conflicts will arise. That is just inevitable. But this gives you a space to kind of work through those as a collective. And the other really nice thing about these, and this is where it fits in with the conflict transformation lens, is that they are helping you move from more short-term solutions to focusing on relationship development in your organization. Okay, okay. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit kind of take it down a little to talk about some more kind of practical strategies and things to consider from a management perspective. So this is maybe just some things for you to think about in your day to day, but then also hopefully that you can employ with your colleagues on, whatever level of leadership team you sit on. What are some of the things that you can maybe take back and share after today? So I'm going to start with some proactive strategies. And with conflict transformation, which again is something that takes time, it's more far reaching, more looking ahead down the horizon than something more of a kind of conflict resolution. And this is anytime you try to change a culture, to truly transform conflict culture, you really need to focus on that big picture. And this is thinking about how to constructively engage in conflict for learning growth and, again, positive change, as I mentioned earlier. Um, Hard to do. I know I keep saying that. It is hard to do, and it is easy to just, deal and move on, or to avoid, to be an Andrea and just avoid the scenario. But that's not how we change culture, right? We just can't do it. So, um, one thing to think about as you're doing this work is to really focus on the epicenter. So you can see on this little chart here, which is kind of a messy chart, but that piece in the middle, the epicenter, this is where you're starting to look for patterns that exhibit themselves over time. So it's helping you figure out what the relational context is to the conflicts that keep occurring. So this is something that is not an approach that you would use to think about like all conflicts that exist in your organization, but rather specific instances that seem to keep coming up over and over. So just as a broad example, if you have two team members that are constantly at odds with each other, what are the patterns of those conflicts? Are they the same thing over and over? What kind of similarities can you see? And then starting to think about what that context is. So are the patterns related to their role clarity? Are they related to scope of their positions? Really spending some time reflecting on that epicenter piece can help you move forward. And this requires building an understanding of all of the levels of the conflict. So that big picture, again, but then also the processes for addressing immediate problems and conflicts, and then thinking ahead to the future and what a plan for changing those processes may look like to help you move in a direction to get past this particular type of conflict. Um, for truly sustainable structural changes, I think, as we all know, you need to build in this process at every level of the organization. This work cannot happen without both vertical and horizontal integration. This chart here is based on Letterrock's levels of action for peace building and kind of looking at like what levels of community members are engaged in change for peace building. But I think it fits really well to our library, or really honestly, any organization as well. So at the top, you've got the senior leadership, and this is the group that is providing strategic direction, some policy development. There's high level structural changes can happen at this level. And then you have the middle managers, that kind of next level down. This is the group that is implementing the changes, right? They're helping with training. They're translating the high level strategy from senior leadership into action. And they're often serving as mediators, as I mentioned before. What does that look like in this process? A lot of us sit there. So thinking about how that fits with the senior leadership. And then finally, you have more of the kind of grassroots. This is the bottom up change. These are when everyone in the organization is developing relationships. Hopefully, they're building a culture of trust and accountability. And then they're engaging often in peer to peer negotiations. Um, all of this is important. This is where I think we see the most structural kind of just stoppage related to sustainable change when it comes to conflict management and resolution and transformation. Um, we have, I think, a lot of times like things get stuck in the middle, right? And you have senior leadership that is making, structural changes, but not thinking about what that looks like all the way down and vice versa. So a really important piece, I think, for us as managers to think about where we sit and what kind of changes we can make to help kind of move forward the action from these different levels. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about like proactive stuff and like long term trying to make changes and what that looks like. But I do want to address that sometimes conflicts arise and you need to respond and address them in the moment. And you have to do that, right? You can't avoid that kind of focus or addressing of a problem in order to get that kind of longer term. So I just want to acknowledge that you have both a short term and a longer term plan in place when it comes to conflict transformation. Um, because when things happen in the moment, they're triggered by all sorts of things. There may be some provocation, body language, misunderstandings in meetings or via email, all of those kinds of things. You need to address it in order to help contribute to that healthy culture. So that's sometimes its own kind of stress, right? For especially if you're not used to mediating conflicts, or that's just something that you haven't had a lot of experience with. So this is a kind of a frame or some practical tips really that you can use in the moment. So this is like kind of thinking about if you're in a meeting and something comes up and it's sort of stressful and you need to figure out how to deal with it. So there's this kind of three-step process. First is acknowledging. So saying or doing something in the moment to acknowledge the tension in the room. You probably won't have the right words, and that's okay. Just making sure that you're authentic in whatever it is that you're saying. So an example of how you could address this is saying something like, it feels like there's a lot of tension in the room right now. Can we take a minute and think about where it's coming from? So you acknowledge it, and then you try to open the door to discuss it. You also need to discern whether or not this is the moment to address it. So, oftentimes a conflict will arise in a group situation, and it really only involves that individual or that individual and someone else who's not even at the meeting. So, if it's a moment where you don't think that you necessarily need to address the issue right then, or that it's something that you need more information on, or that you can tell like is already there's kind of some emotional temperature taking and you're realizing that everyone's a little bit stressed out or something's just not quite right. Realizing that it's okay to take a break and follow up later when you have more information and when you have more time. That's an important piece of this. And also I would say that a little bit, addressing something kind of in the moment, acknowledging that there was a situation that arose, but then taking a pause and coming back to it later is a good practice towards conflict transformation because it allows you to dig a little deeper and to do that kind of authentic listening and determination. Another thing to consider here, is the fact that people may not engage, especially if you're trying to address it kind of in the moment. People may just not want to engage in the process, and so it's important to think to yourself, what is within my power to do, especially in this moment, and then what can I live with or not. Both helpful questions to ask yourself in the moment and also in the future as well. Finally, if necessary, de-escalating is a really important piece of this kind of response strategy. So that's slowing down the pace of the conversation, trying to, again, lower that emotional temperature and move towards something that's a little bit more intentional or mindful. This is a great spot to use the reframing language from earlier. So one example sort of phrase that you could use, that's a different perspective from mine. And I'm wondering how you came to see it that way. So giving that opportunity for whoever, is having the frustration or issue or whatever it is to share the why behind behind that reaction. It's also important to remember at this moment that you may need to bring in a more facilitated or structured approach to dealing with this conflict. And that may not be something you're equipped to do, in which case it's a good idea to see what other opportunities or other avenues are available to you in your library or your institution. So along that same line, thinking about just conflict conversations in general, one thing that this from Dr. Sarah McDonald that I learned that I really like is not calling them difficult conversations, but calling them conflict conversations. I feel like when you say a difficult conversation, it sort of has this implication that like the people involved are difficult, and that's not the case, right? It may be a like hard conversation to have. But if you reframe it again as a conflict conversation, it's a way for you to see this conversation fits into this bigger systemic change that I'm trying to make. And so it also, I think, is maybe a little more neutral or less emotional. So how do you go about that? What are some things to remember? Observe the causes of the conflict. So this is a good moment to stop and do your own temperature check. What am I feeling and why? But then also, what are others seeming to feel? And you can do this through observing specific actions or behaviors that people involved in the conflict are exhibiting. Then clarifying your goal for the conversation. So what would you like to be different based on what you have observed? And then identifying common ground. We've already talked about this a couple times, but identifying those shared values and interests and wins for everyone in the conflict situation. And then choosing the time and place. So this kind of goes back to like, is this the right moment to engage in this conversation in a group meeting with other people that really have nothing to do with the conflict? And also thinking about like where you're having those meetings. Are you inviting someone to your office where there is an obvious, kind of power differential in terms of, the boss's office versus maybe meeting at a coffee shop or somewhere that's a little bit more kind of safe ground, essentially. Um, Finally, the last thing that I want to touch on here, and I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but I think that this is a really important piece because so much of this process that I've talked about today is at the system level and thinking about how to change culture in your organization. But really, you cannot do that or you cannot contribute to that unless you are having kind of your own mindful and sustainable practices as a manager, as a leader in your library. So I wanted to share just a couple of things to kind of consider as you're thinking about your own work. And there's room for you to explore this on the worksheet that I shared earlier. You're not going to do it in the next 5 minutes. You need some practice here, but just some things for you to be thinking about. One of which is thinking about your conflict style. We talked about that earlier, but really being authentically self-aware in that way. So I'll be honest, I do sometimes avoid, like I want to always be on that kind of collaborating, problem-solving spectrum, but sometimes I avoid. And so I know that about myself. And so it's something that I know that I need to consider and think about when I am doing this work. So be honest with yourself and hundreds of other people in the room. Um, Also, thinking about those community agreements again. So, really thinking about purposeful and authentic community building in your library organization is such an important part of this. And it is really important for you, again, to be authentic in this work in order to build trust in your organization. Always thinking about like that deeper dive into what's really going on, what the true issue is. So, one way to kind of do this is rather than just getting frustrated that people aren't working together or aren't like coming at things from the same perspective, is to frame all of those differing perspectives as both a strength to be valued and a productive challenge. So not negative, but something that you can approach productively. And then finally, talked about this in a couple of different contexts, but making sure that you're establishing transparent and accessible processes that people know and are bought into that hopefully will prevent conflicts in the future. And, you know, again, like conflicts are always going to happen. So it's just something that you can't avoid, but you may be able to anticipate and have that foundation for navigating conflicts that do arrive in a more constructive way. And then finally, just some questions to kind of consider just overall, but then also as you are approaching this conflict transformation work. What energy are you bringing in? What helps you show up as your best self? What else might also be true is, I think, a really important one. And then just remembering and considering, can this actually be a transformational moment? Not all conflicts can be transformed. And I give my brother great credit for helping me learn this. You have like people have to be willing to participate, and you cannot force it as much as the people pleaser and you might want to. um, it just may not happen, and so letting yourself sit with that, letting yourself be okay with that, and realizing that you cannot control everything. So I think like the last thing I just want to say, and then we'll move on to some Q&A here, is just be critically generously curious. I try to approach a lot of what I do as a manager and a teacher and just a human being in a curious way. It helps me because I think like it allows me to be less like deep in with the emotions and try to kind of let some of that go, which is hard when you're trying to live an empathetic life. But building curiosity, being critically curious, I think is a really important piece of this work. So I have one last question for you all, which is giving you a time limit here. So this summer, what is one concrete thing that you would like to try to transform um, conflict in your organization? You can think about a specific individual or a specific scenario, or you can think about kind of just the big picture way of your library handles conflict situations. So kind of thinking about that. We'll come back and look at it in a second, but I also just want to share um, some references and more learning while you're putting in your reflections. And again, I'm going to share all of this. I will add my slides to that link I gave you earlier with the worksheet, and then I'm also going to put them in the Calm space wherever that is. So okay, yeah, I think that's what we've got. So I'm really excited to see if we've got any questions, and I might stop sharing for this moment.
Thank you so much,
Weird not seeing
Melissa.
everyone.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have lots of questions, so I'm gonna get to as many as I can, and I might combine a few. And I hope you're seeing also the thanks in the chat. So I'm going to read this first question here, which also has a comment on it, which is the question is it possible to get to conflict transformation when almost everyone in the library is conflict avoidant? And then the comment is, I was very surprised to see so many people identify their style as collaborating problem solving when my experience is that conflict avoidance is the most prevalent in libraries. It may
Huh.
speak to the specific population attending this conference, or the majority of people think they are self-aware when they actually are not.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Liz, is I think that that's why that 30 question instrument is really helpful because it helps you identify actually what based on, it's kind of like a strengths finder sort of instrument. I think that we all want to hope that we are, in that collaborating zone, and you probably are. And again, like it's very contextual. Um, so I think that's something to remember, and that you do kind of ebb and flow depending on the conflict. Can you transform the culture when everyone or most everyone is avoidant? I think yes. I think you can. It's just going to be harder work to do, and we start with that work, right? Like we can't wait for other people to do it. We've got to do it. If you care about it, if you want to see changes, you have to do the work. And maybe it's like you're reframing your perspective of what success looks like. You may not be able to change the entire organization, but could you start with your team? Could you start with, smaller subsets of your library? I think that's one way you can kind of deal with that when it feels like you're off in the trees, like the poll from earlier, and you want to try to get back on the road.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw someone in the chat earlier talk about how taking the high road can be tiring.
Yeah.
And that is so true. So, all right, our next question involves an acronym that is new to me, which is most libraries have at least one, usually more cave people, colleagues against virtually everything. This can cause varying degrees of conflict, and I'm curious if you've encountered this in your own work and what positive transformation strategies have you used?
Yeah. This honestly, I know I've not heard of Cade either, so I'm gonna remember that one. Sometimes these are the ones that you just have to let go. You try, like I'm not saying stop trying. I think it's really important to continue, especially if it's someone on your team, that you are managing. Like you got to figure out where that line is of letting them be kind of the grumpy one to like, I'm sorry, we've got to productively move forward and accomplish our work. But if it's a bigger picture, something that is not necessarily like a management issue, um, you may just have to let them go. And it kind of goes back to that piece that like you can bring people along, but you can't force them along. And just acknowledging that, I think lets a lot of the anxiety off because it's just an important thing to remember.
Thank you. Forgot to mark that. All right. So I'm gonna combine these next two. One is how to handle a mismatch between your conflict style and how your staff perceive your conflict style. And then how do you implement a collaborative style of management when your own supervisor leads more toward a competing approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, and there are like formal ways that you can kind of get into this a little bit, like 360 reviews, if anyone's done anything like that, or even just making up your own kind of um, assessment or survey for your team in which you can have them do it, anonymously, but like, how do you think I handle conflicts? Or what is what is the approach you think that is being displayed here? That could be very telling. Just like, again, we may all think that we're collaborating and problem solving, but we may be experiencing or displaying a little bit of the avoidance or one of the other categories. So, being honest and asking your team, and then important part, listening. Like, see what their comments are, and then take that in and reflect on it. And then, hopefully have an open conversation if that would be helpful. I think in terms of your supervisor, sometimes that's something that you may not be able to change, right? Like you can change yourself and you can change, the way that you approach something. But I also don't think it's necessarily fair to ask an individual to change themselves to match the person that they, supervise or they're supervised by. So one thing I would say there is the kind of going back to looking at the mutual um, values and needs and interests that may exist between you and say your supervisor. Where can you find some of that common ground? And if you have a sense of how they are approaching conflict and how you approach conflict, thinking about if there's a way that you can maybe move into more of that compromising like the like no way kind of thing, right? Where it's not like my way or your way, but how can you take on a little bit of the load there to reframe what you're asking for in a way that will be heard by them. And I recognize that that is not always a fair burden to put on us, but sometimes that's just how it is.
Thank you. Yeah, or maybe just send them the recording of this presentation.
Yes.
Um, all right. So the next question is also related to the one we just you just answered, which is how do we show accommodating conflict styles? I assume people with accommodating conflict styles that conflict is not bad and disagreements can support institutional growth. Also, the whiteness of conflict avoidance is so harmful. So a lot there, but
Yeah, that is a lot, and probably more than we have time to talk about today. But I do think that as much transparency as possible is a really important way to kind of move forward. Um, and sometimes that's something that you can control as a leader. You can have those conversations. Depending on, who that avoider is, it might be more appropriate to have a one-on-one conversation. I noticed you're not speaking up in meetings, or I noticed that you had this reaction in our team meeting earlier. Can you talk about, what's behind that, or what are you concerned about? And you may have more success in that one-on-one situation. But honestly, like my colleagues hear me say this all the time. It all comes down to communication. Like if you avoid the avoiders, then nothing is going to change, and it is just going to be a mess forever. So really thinking about um, how you can dig a little bit more deeply, beyond the surface level with that individual and help them see how their perspective is extremely important. And there's lots of ways you could do that, like in from how to lead meetings and things like that. But I would just start by talking to them, honestly.
great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think we have time for a few more, right? You let me know
Yeah,
if you are full up on questions.
I'm good.
Um, But this next one is, can you share how the literature you read on this topic addressed intersectionality, specifically how social and personal identities may impact or influence outcomes in the conflict transformation process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there is a lot on that, not so much from an organizational standpoint, but from that kind of community peace building standpoint. And so some of the articles that I link to in my resources, I think are really good reads, like to see how peace builders are leading this work out in the world, because honestly, like it takes all of those perspectives and it takes that intersectionality to be able to understand the root of the conflict and get back against that kind of epicenter where you start seeing some of the patterns that may exist. And so I think this is where the kind of coming to a mutual understanding or a mutual agreement is really important, because it's not just you recognizing this is what this group wants and this is what this group wants, or this person has potentially competing interests. You need to recognize that, but you also need hopefully or you should do the work to help both of those parties see that from one another. So it's kind of in that sort of mediator mode. And I have just personally found a lot of success with that in my work environments where, you know, we talk about what the values are that each party is bringing to the conversation. And oftentimes those are the same values. They just aren't thinking about it that way. And so I think that yeah, there's a lot more that I think we could talk about with that, but I would say um, reading some of these articles on peace building and especially like divided society communities can really give you some good insights into how to approach like that person, even like beyond just from a like a work, context, but like the personal context. I think we see that a lot in libraries, right? That like we have a lot of like very deeply held values. And so what does that look like as you're trying to transform conflict?
Thank you so much. I think we'll have to leave it there. Even though there's lots of questions here, we can save it for you. Thank you so much, Melissa, for answering all
Yeah.
those questions, for the great presentation. I really learned a lot. Yeah, all your applause. Before we close the
Awesome.
session, I do want to point out the evaluation survey that Beth put in the chat. It's available also through the Sched, and when the Zoom closes, I know Melissa will appreciate your feedback. So thank you all for attending. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you around.
Thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate it. Thanks again to Beth. Thanks to all of you. And please email me if you want to talk about any of this. I would love to do that. And have a great rest of your conference.